people who are more socially connected had a 50% increased odds of survival relative to those who
50, you said?
50, yeah.
Hi, this is Soumya, and you are listening to Loneliness Busters, a podcast where I talk to founders, researchers, policymakers, investors, community builders, and more on how to build a more connected world. I hope you join the squad. We need all hands on deck now more than ever. Hi, everyone. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Julianne Holt-Lunstad. Dr. Holt-Lunstad is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University. Her groundbreaking work has been pivotal in establishing social isolation and loneliness as risk factors for early mortality. She is the lead scientific editor of the U.S. General Recent Advisory on Loneliness and Social Connection. She is the founding scientific chair and board member of U.S. Foundation for Social Connection and a member of many National Academy of Sciences committees, European Joint Research Council, World Health Organization member, among others. I'm very grateful to have you today with us. Doctor, welcome to the pod.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Let's kick off. I'd love to go back to the beginning. I would love to understand from you what got you interested in researching loneliness and social connection in the first place. How did it all start?
Yeah. So when I was in grad school, I was doing a lot of psychophysiology studies. So these were laboratory-based studies where we would bring people into the lab, and really we were looking at how stress impacts health. But related to that was how relationships can help us cope with stress and like buffer some of those physiological responses. There were kind of two things that moved me into the direction. The first was the recognition that our relationships are important beyond just the context of stress. Also, I was really struck by the idea that when I would talk to people outside of my little area of academia, that most people didn't recognize the impacts that our social relationships have on our health. So people widely recognize how important our relationships are for our emotional well-being and could maybe even see how it might impact mental health. But people didn't think that it had anything to do with their physical health. And in a way, that idea felt a little, I don't know, for lack of a scientific word, a little woo-woo, a little out there. And so it really, I think, directly influenced my work that tried to establish some of the overall effects of social relationships on risk for premature mortality, just to really get a sense of just how impactful this is, because of course, I knew of many large-scale epidemiological studies that had demonstrated this, but yet the general public, the medical field didn't seem to really acknowledge this. And so I set out to look at this more broadly to determine just like how big is this? How impactful is this?
And what an impact you've had in the public sphere of discussion. I must thank you before we go ahead on the discourse that you and Surgeon General have kicked off in the US and globally. Some of the statistics that we all hear of is a direct result of your research. So thank you so much for your commitment to the space. One of the things you mentioned was how few people really recognize the impact of social connection on our physiological health, especially our body. I come from India, and this notion of mind and body being interrelated has been there in the history of the nation. But even then, my generation and the next generation, like, oh, what are you talking about? That doesn't sound scientific at all. So what surprised you the most as you started uncovering this data in your research?
Well, I think when I did my first meta-analysis by combining all the available data where studies had looked at how socially connected someone was and followed them up over time to see if that predicted who was alive or dead at the follow-up. And these studies ranged in length of that follow-up, but on average, it was 7.5 years. And so what this found was that people who were more socially connected had a 50% increased odds of survival relative to those who
50, you said?
50. Yeah. Yeah.
That is a huge number. And is that the highest of any social determinants of health?
So different indicators of social connection varied in their magnitude, but that was the overall. So the odds ratio is 1.5, so 50% increased odds. Yeah.
So your prescription is everybody should go get more friends, have more happy hours.
There is a movement towards what being referred to as social prescribing. So we'll have to see.
I want to become a professional in that. How do you prescribe people to have a better social life? But you started to talk about the components of social connection and the fact that not all components are equally weighed. Help us understand how you define social connection. Is it the number of people you have? Is it the quality? Is it what relationships you have? Like, what matters and what are these components?
Yeah. So as you just described, there are so many different ways in which we can connect with people, right? And so many different ways to measure that. Just as you said, the number of relationships, the quality of these relationships, the extent you can rely on them, all of these different things. And so when we did that overall meta-analysis, this was averaged across all of those. And so from that, what we realized was that we tried to parse out, okay, well, are some better predictors than others, right? If we're kind of lumping all of these things together, maybe some differ. And what we started to do was to identify that, generally speaking, these measures varied in terms of three different components and what labeled the structure, function, and quality of relationships. So the structure gets at these almost kind of numeric, quantifiable kinds of indicators, just like you said, the size of someone's social network, um, how frequently they participate, whether or not they participate in a group, uh, whether or not they live alone, whether or not they are married. So it's very quantifiable, it's very structured. But really, what these measures get at is the existence of other people in your life. And so that's the first component. The second component really gets at the functions that these people may serve, right? So it may not, while it may be necessary for us to have people in our lives in order to have some of these benefits, that may not be sufficient. So the function really gets at to what extent we can rely on others to serve various needs and goals in our life. And so, and we know that relationships can be sources of information, sources of actual physical kinds of support. They can help us feel better. They can serve all these different kinds of functions. And so that's the second component. And then the third component really is the quality of the relationships, which is recognizing that not all relationships are entirely positive and that some relationships can be frustrating, can be sources of conflict and strain. And so what we identified was these three different components that all are linked to health outcomes and survival. But what's interesting is that they're tapping into slightly different things. So you can have people in your life, but they may not be high quality or you may not be able to rely on them, right? Or you might have one or two really high quality relationships that you don't have this broad network to rely on. Or there can be people who are giving you advice or helping you out, but in the process, there's a lot of negativity or strain in that. So it might be very controlling. And so what we recognize is that all three of these components are important and that when people have high levels of each of these components or high levels. So we use social connection as this umbrella term to encompass these components. And so when social connection is high, it's associated with lower risk. And when social connection is low, it's associated with higher risk.
It's very interesting. As I think when I started off this journey a few months back, the first thing I did was talk to, I think at this point, maybe 200 plus people. And I was talking to them on how they understand loneliness, how do they feel it. And the three components you mentioned overlay so nicely with the four things I saw, which is people say that they're lonely, but it means different things to different people. There's loneliness of people, which is I just don't have enough people in my life, right? It's the end problem. There's loneliness of trust, which meant that I have people, but they don't get me and I don't feel understood and I don't feel seen and heard. And then the third one was loneliness of purpose, which is an interesting one because I didn't realize that people will say they're lonely, but in reality, what they meant was they're not feeling that their existence matter, right? And so there was the loneliness of purpose, which kind of go into function. Not all relationships are relationships of deep emotional connect. Some of them are, I belong to this community because I have a larger purpose, right? It could be a social cause, it could be a religious setup, right? And the last one was the most shocking to me, which is loneliness of play, which is people were just too busy and they're like, I have all of this, but I don't have time to spend with the people I care about. And so I don't have enough light moments in my life. And so it also goes to function, which is not all relationships and social connection need to be serious talk, right? Some of it is just letting yourself loose and de-stress. Let's go into these one by one. The structure. Is there a minimum N? Is this an N problem? I guess part of it is an N problem. Of course, loneliness and social isolation is also at some points overlapping. So tell us about what did you find in the quantity?
So first off, a lot of the studies look at these on a continuum and treat them continuously so that people who have more are associated with lower risk, fewer associated with higher risk. And indeed, there are some studies that have shown a gradient effect or a dose response effect. So for every level of increase in social connection, there was a decrease in risk across various indicators. But I've certainly been asked multiple times, questions like either how many friends do I need for a health benefit or, just how many people do I need in my life? And interestingly, I recently published a piece on the evidence to support establishing national health guidelines for social connection, like we would for dietary guidelines or sleep or exercise. And so, of course, to establish this would go through a consensus committee. When it comes to quantity, like I said, there's this continuum, but we also kind of want to know what's the bare minimum, what might be adequate, and then what might we want to aim for if we really want to thrive, right? And so the bare minimum is more than one. We don't want to be completely isolated, right? So that would be the bare minimum. But in order to have what studies might suggest to be adequate, it's imperfect at this point, but what some of the studies suggest that this might be somewhere around 4 to 6 people. And let me explain why that might be the case, because I hear quite often people say things like, oh, you don't need a lot of people in your life. You just need a couple of really good friends or, really close relationships. And yes, having that is certainly good, but may not be sufficient. So what we have shown in studies is that we go to different kinds of people for different kinds of needs. And so if you think about the different relationships in your own life and the kinds of things that you might go to from your coworkers might differ from your mom or your romantic partner or your neighbor, right? So your neighbor might be really helpful when you need to, say, borrow a rake or you need some kind of tool to borrow. But closer kinds of relationships might be more helpful when it comes to fulfilling needs of intimacy. Your coworkers might help fulfill needs of competency. And so both relationships with, say, family members and coworkers fulfill needs of meaning and purpose, but in different ways, right? And so if we think about this, what research has shown is having a diversity of kinds of relationships helps us navigate the challenges of life better because we have a diversity of different kinds of resources that we can draw upon for advice or a favor, whatever we might need at the time. And so this can help us through a variety of kinds of circumstances. And so that 4 to 6 seems to be the number that evidence is pointing to. As far as thriving, it's interesting because we don't have a good of upper number. So some studies suggest more than 6 is better than the 4 to 6. But at what point does it become too much, right? We don't have a good sense of that, the upper limits of that.
That's interesting. There has been in the social connection world a differentiation between social integration and close connections. What is your take on the low stake, more pervasive connections that you have around you versus these 4 to 6 that might be closer
Yeah,
connections?
so we have
you
good
don't agree
evidence
with?
that the kinds of casual relationships that we have, or even just interactions with strangers, sometimes this has been referred to as weak ties, that these are important too. So the people that we interact with as we engage in society and in our communities, whether it's the person at the checkout line or the person we walk past and wave and say hello to in our neighborhood, uh, these kinds of small interactions have been shown to be beneficial also. And so that 4 to 6 is going to be more of a relationship versus the kind of social interactions that we have throughout the day that might be more with ac- either objective strangers or people that we may have regular interaction with, but don't have any kind of close relationships. It might be the barista that you see on a regular basis, and it might be the same person, but you're not hanging out on weekends together. And so it's someone that you consistently see, and
Yeah. No, it's interesting how these moments of quote unquote consistency give you normalcy, especially when things might not be going well in your work or in your personal life. You go to the yoga studio, you go to your barista, and you're like, oh, okay, they still exist.
yeah, and that we're part of something bigger. And I think it's so interesting because the pandemic, when everyone was on lockdown, those small little interactions, just having human contact. Do you remember how, like, one of the first times when you went out and it was just like, oh my gosh, there's another human being?
Right. And especially for me, I'm an extreme extrovert. For me, I remember in my fellowship, my professor called me on. They'd done an MBTI. This is like 2011 or something like that, 10, 15 years back. And they called me on the podium. And they're like, this is a breed. She is 30 on 30 extrovert. If she doesn't see another human for 3 days, there might be like health risks. And I feel like over time, I've of course come to the middle of the spectrum and I need my own time, etc. But yes, the COVID, especially the first few months, were jarring for a lot of people. We discussed the quantity issue. We also discussed and touched upon the function. Let's discuss the quality of relationship. You talked about how not all relationships give you the same amount of benefit. Some may be unhealthy or even toxic. In fact, pressure of social connection is one of the biggest pressure that social media has brought to forefront, right? So tell us about how you think about quality of relationship and what kind of
Yeah. So
relationships are healthy versus unhealthy.
one thing to keep in mind is there's been, of course, a lot of emphasis on loneliness, which in essence is the absence of, or the discrepancy between what one desires and what one has. But that's different than the actual presence of negativity in a relationship. And so we have to think about the quality, and all of our relationships vary in the degree to how positive and how negative they are. And evidence has shown that negativity in relationships can not only increase stress, but can be associated with some of these physiological responses, which over time are sustained and chronic, could potentially lead to poor health outcomes. And so these can range anywhere from the kinds of relationships where there is a lot of conflict and strain, but doesn't necessarily elevate to the level of abuse, right? And so, of course, there's a wide range there from minor frustrations, which probably all relationships can be frustrating at some point in time, um, to these more extreme ends. So I think we have to be really careful because on the one hand, we need to not just dismiss the quality of relationships, because especially as we think about many people that are lonely, if we try to increase social contact with people, we could potentially be increasing contact where there's conflict, right? And so it may not necessarily be helpful. And so we have to be very careful there. But on the other hand, we can't be so um avoidant of any kind of frustration or conflict that we refuse to engage with other people who have different perspectives than our own. And so there's a big spectrum there. And we have to be very careful because in some ways, cutting people out entirely who don't believe the same things as you has led to a lot of divisions in our communities that is contributing to isolation and loneliness. And what we need to think about is, how do we increase the positivity in our relationships and decrease the negativity in our relationship?
Yeah, no, I think as you were talking, what I got reminded of is this example that I think Surgeon General writes about in his book, that research has shown that if you get people to do fun things together before they talk politics or before they talk about things that they disagree on, there's a high probability that they'll find a common ground. And so it's, especially in the age of social media, it's so easy to focus on the 1% things that you and I differ on, and then not realize that the 99% of the life issues and aspirations are the same. Everybody wants to be happy and healthy and have a good life and have their family do well, etc., etc. You talked about the social prescription. So I have one question for you, which you can choose to answer or not answer. I would love to hear from you how you define, or how you would think about defining, healthy social connection goals for individuals. One of the things that I've been grappling with over the last few months is almost all the other well-being metric, whether it's physical activity or sleep, has some sort of recommendation which is concrete, whether it's sedentary time, 10,000 steps, 8 hours of sleep, consistent sleep time, and such. And so tell us about how you think of healthy social
Yeah.
goals
So
that
I think that the 4 to 6 relationships fall under the analogous category of getting your 5 fruits and vegetables a day, right? And maybe because it's 4 to 6, you could think about, okay, just like I think about, did I get my fruits and vegetables? And do I have my 4 to 6 relationships? But also similar to the physical activity kinds of guidelines where you should be physically active every day. Similarly, you want to aim for having some kind of social activity each day, interacting with someone. You don't want to be completely alone and isolated all day long. And so thinking about that, and similar to physical activity, the sometimes our busy lives can crowd that out, right? And we have to make time for it. We have to carve out time to be physically active. You need to do that with social activity. And if you're having time doing that, go for a walk with a friend, because then you're doing both. So I would suggest that. Also, we need to be open to both providing and accepting support from others. We live in a society where we value our independence. And so not only is it really difficult to accept help even when it's offered, but sometimes we may actually need help, but aren't willing to either ask for it or accept it. But what we also have evidence of is that providing support to others, so looking for opportunities to help people, not only can build social capital because we have strong norms of reciprocity. So by helping someone else, there's an increased likelihood that you'll be able to get help when you need it. But there's good evidence that just simply helping other people makes you feel better. And in fact, the research shows that providing support to others actually has stronger benefits than receiving support from others. And so looking for ways to help other people not only can help you, but it can also strengthen that relationship and the social bonds with the person that you're uh, helping. Oh, and I think back to some of the consistency of interacting regularly is that another recommendation is to find some kind of group to be a part of. And we all need some kind of group. And that doesn't mean that every group's going to be right for everyone. Just like not every exercise is right for everyone. Right? Some people prefer running, some people swimming, some people hiking it, whatever your preference is. But having a group can be really important for a sense of belonging, that sense of purpose. But what's also really amazing about groups is they provide a sense of consistency. And so we know that to both make relationships, to create relationships, and to maintain relationships, it takes time. And we need to invest that time. And groups often have a regularity to them. So whether it is a book club that meets monthly or you're attending a church, which meets weekly, or an exercise group that meets daily, there's a regular cadence to many groups. And when you belong to them, not only does it help you deepen these relationships over time, but then you have a sense of community and support that when something may happen, you have this group that you can rely on for support. So that would be another recommendation. And then, of course, in terms of quality, is really finding ways to increase the positivity in relationships. One way that has been shown to influence that is by expressions of gratitude. Often, when we share with others how much we appreciate aspects or something that they have done or said or whatever, that this gratitude can help strengthen some of those bonds. It also comes back to often what we're taught as children. If you want to have friends, you need to be a good friend, right? And I think sometimes as an adult, we wait for others to be the one to invite us to a social gathering, or to what extent are they there for you when you need them? But to what extent are you uh, initiating getting together? To what extent are you reaching out and being there for your friends when they need someone, or to celebrate their success? As we practice the kinds of behaviors that we hope for in others, that can strengthen our relationships and increase our well-being in the process.
Thank you so much. I think all of us can take a few of these and implement every day. So, nurture 4 to 6 friends. Spend time every day socially connecting, not every month. It needs to be every day. So, same as workout. Help others, become a part of a regular group, increase positivity through gratitude, and become a good friend. That's awesome. Can I double click on last point that you mentioned on, which is be a good friend, expressions of gratitude, etc. I think more and more our life is, we're spending more and more time online, less time offline. Two questions. One is, does it matter for social connection, quality, and whether you're meeting someone online or offline? And second question is, are social skills required in one different than the other? So
That's a tricky
yeah,
question.
online versus offline. That's your take.
Um, so it's tricky because the evidence is quite complex, and how we interact with others online can vary dramatically, right? From just scrolling people's social media feeds to see what they're doing to actually having conversations over, video chat. So they vary quite dramatically. And so it's really hard to just simply kind of lump them all into one category. And there is some evidence that we can find support online, particularly among those that may lack the kind of support that they need locally. Uh, but it doesn't seem to replace the need for in-person kind of contact. So it may help facilitate some social connection, or even compensate to some extent for when it's lacking, but it doesn't completely replace in-person contact. So I don't know if that fully answered your question, but I guess the short answer is it's complex, and but then there may be some benefits, but we shouldn't rely on it entirely.
Let's move on to thinking about large scale structural solutions. I think so much of this also depends on how we design our workplaces and our surroundings and our neighborhoods and our policy. Let's start with the health system. What is the role of health system in this crisis? I think UN Surgeon General talk about it as a health crisis.
So when we lack social connection, it increases risk for cardiovascular disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, so many different chronic health conditions. It also impacts even things like our likelihood of developing a cold. It can influence our immune functioning and ultimately can influence our survival. It's clear it has health implications, and it is a health issue. And so the fact that it has these effects makes it clear point at which the healthcare system needs to engage in this. Unfortunately, in many cases, providers lack the training and resources and support to deal with it. And because it's for so long been thought of as simply a emotional kind of well-being issue, the many providers may have viewed this as not relevant to what they do. They're about fixing broken bones and, um, or clogged arteries or whatever it might be, but that this was not part of their job description. And I should say that has, of course, changed quite a bit. And the medical community is beginning to see the importance and relevance of this and other social determinants of health to their patients. But again, still, even among those that recognize its importance, often lack the resources and support. So I know this is important. My patients are coming in. I know they're isolated. I know they're lonely, but I feel helpless and don't know what to do about it.
What can be done about it at this health system level?
Yes.
What is the gold medal here?
So
What kind of
I
infrastructure does health
post a
system
piece
need?
in the New England Journal of Medicine that offers a very simple framework that can be applied in the healthcare setting and by healthcare providers. And it uses the acronym EAR. So EAR. So not only should it have the connotation of, listen to your patients, but it stands for, so E is for educate, A for assess, and R for respond. So the educate is to help patients become aware of how their level of social connection is impacting their health, whether that's from a preventative standpoint or how it impacts their current health condition and their treatment plan. So the assess is to assess patients' level of social connection to help identify patients who might be either at risk or are currently experiencing significant difficulty that might currently impact their treatment, or to help identify someone who is at a point where this could potentially impact their health moving forward. And then the R is the respond is identifying what the needs are of this patient and responding appropriately. It just like you want to get at the underlying cause of any other kind of condition and respond accordingly. You would need to do so for this as well. And so there could be that social prescription of, hey, I'm going to connect you to a local community resource where you can get this, get engaged with your community. And that might be fine for some patients, but for others, it might be, hey, I don't have anyone to support me with my diabetes management of it. So then it might need to be that kind of support. Or they're they have untreated hearing loss and they're having a hard time understanding or following conversations and have just really uh, kind of disengaged with others and become more isolated. And so treating that hearing impairment will be the thing that can help them to perhaps reduce some of that isolation. So for different patients, that might mean different things, but it's really being responsive to that patient's needs.
Awesome. I'll remember that. It's a good abbreviation here. Um, let's go through the E, which is education. Do you think social skills can be learned? More recently, I think both OECD and WHO have recommended to include social skill building and learning as a part of the health curriculum, if you may. What is your
Yeah, so
perspective on education
so
around social skills?
education can come in lots of different forms. Social skills could be one important part, and in fact, there have been many recommendations around this, particularly for young children, as they're learning to navigate their social world, and often our social relationships early in life predict later life kinds of outcomes, including later life relationships and later health. Um, so social skills early in life are going to be really important. Although, of course, we've all encountered many adults that could use potentially benefit from that. But we can't assume that for everyone who might be isolated or lonely or lack social connection in some way that it's simply a matter of lacking skills. Because we know that there may be other kinds of barriers that may be a result of that. Uh, but in terms of education, not only should that include the kinds of social skills, but also uh, when we think about even just in the US, the K through 12 education, the public education, then this education as part of their health curriculum, that this is part of what influences health. So just like we learn about other lifestyle factors that impact our health, we need to educate people on how their social connections are just as important as these other kinds of factors that are perhaps more well recognized.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about this. I think when I was at Fitbit, we discussed a lot the American Heart Association's Life Essential 8, and they, of course, added sleep, I think, recently in the last 12, 18 months. And as I was going through your research, he kept coming back to me. It's like, hey, is this something that should actually be added at that level? Because the data shows that it is as impactful as all of the other factors, if not more, right? Like smoking, which is on the list, or sleep, or diet, or exercise. Um, on the social skill building and education, I think one of the interesting things that I have noticed, and I have not done research on it, and would love to see if there's research out there, is if in fact actually social skills have deteriorated even for adults, given the fact that we always have phone in front of us, and so we avoid the first 5 minutes of awkward conversation just to not go through that plight and just may forego the lifetime of friendship. I think personally, I used to love international travels. It was to be the best way for me to get to know someone, because 4 hours, 6 hours of flight, and you have someone next to you and you have a conversation on their life. And I feel like in the last 3 years, I've had almost zero conversations on flight just because the screen is in front of me all the time. And so there's also, as you said, I think, of course, children can benefit. I also think that I have forgotten the skill of actually just breaking the ice and having a conversation, because I always have something to run to, which is my phone all the time. One last question before we go to a fun section is, are there risks of over medicalizing loneliness and measuring loneliness? Of course, loneliness is not a disease, just like hunger is not a disease. It's a body's reaction to it missing an essential ingredient to life.
Yeah,
So,
it's part of the human experience. Humans are social beings, and throughout human history, we have needed to rely on others. And so it's considered a biological need. And so loneliness has been conceptualized, as you said, similar to hunger or thirst. It's a biological drive that signals us that a need is unmet. And so, on the one hand, we would never think of hunger as being medicalized. And in some ways, some people have also thought of loneliness as like a social pain rather than a physical pain. And in some ways, there may be some similar kinds of biological mechanisms. And we think of, again, pain as somewhat of a symptom that may signal where we need to correct something. But we do, when people are in chronic pain, we do need to take extra kinds of efforts. And that's actually incredibly challenging. Just as chronic physical pain can sometimes be very debilitating. Chronic levels of loneliness where people get stuck in this, then that we may need to have more kinds of intervention. But that the goal should always be that this is something that we can move in and out of more regularly. And so we need to be careful of not over medicalizing the normal kind of human experience that we all have. But at the same time, allowing for the extra care and intervention that may be required when it becomes more chronic.
great. Thanks for spending the time. This was such an educational session for me. I learned a lot. I hope the listeners do too. Tell me, what is your favorite social connection ritual?
I have a group of friends, and we get together at least once a month. And so that's one. And then I have to say one other is I love to go on hikes with friends. Because when you're on a trail or you're on a walk, you've got at least an hour
awesome.
to just catch up. No distractions. And you're in nature. It's fantastic.
And you get your steps in too. That's great. Thank you, Doctor, for being here with us today. And thanks for sharing your perspective. Thanks for all the work that you've been doing. It was a pleasure to talk to you. If you're still here, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend who you think should join the Loneliness Busters squad. See you next time.